have literally spent thousands of years thinking about the question or avoiding the question of how to deal with the inevitable end of life. This is literally what religion is. Death is an incredibly important issue for people to discuss and for people to consent into how they want to die and the circumstances surrounding their death. This currently does not happen, and our case will bring you why legalizing non-voluntary euthanasia would make that conversation happen and would increase the amount of consent surrounding death rather than decrease it. A few points in setup and the model before two pieces of substantive. But a couple of things in the model. First of all, in this world, obviously voluntary euthanasia is also legal, and people are able to do things like sign advance directives to opt into that voluntary euthanasia when they prefer that. Second of all, the system is probably going to be like legislated for multiple checks and balances to prevent abuse. Things like having multiple family members consent into non-voluntary euthanasia, active non-voluntary euthanasia. Things like screening those members of families to say that there's no like financial conflict of interest or like previous abuse. Thirdly, there's probably going to be a process in which, as the info slide says, there's a justification of how the euthanasia is actually minimizing suffering. So for example, if the doctor thinks that the patient has a clear chance of recovering and like having a good quality of life, obviously this is probably not going to be allowed. So those are the points in the model. Any clarifications? Okay. First argument, why this changes the society view of death and how people deals with death and how that results in more consent. There are some problems with the status quo in that people are incredibly uncomfortable with confronting their death. This is because our culture don't talk about death a lot. Our media often avoids discussions of death, portrays it in a very romanticized way or in a very oblique way. We often have religions telling us to avoid the question of death through narratives such as the afterlife. We also have people just having an inherent fear of death, which means that they don't talk about it with their loved ones because they have a very debilitating fear of the oblivion. But second of all, even when people are closer to death, for example when they're older, people don't want to think about the circumstances in which they are going to die. Think about their health conditions, their will, what is going to happen after their death, etc. This can be displayed in the fact that most people in our society today die without a will, even though if you ask them 20 years previously or even 5 years previously to their death whether or not they would prefer to have a will and prefer to sort out how their money and stuff is distributed among their children and stuff, they'll probably say yes. But actually going to write a will and actually deciding the circumstances of their death, writing an advance directive and such is incredibly painful for these people, because thinking about their approaching death is the thing that is incredibly painful for these older individuals especially. And therefore these individuals are likely to put that thing off and avoid conversations with people like their loved ones about the circumstances surrounding their death, and that is incredibly unhealthy. Third of all, when people don't make choices about their death, there is a denial of agency here because of the debilitating fear that they face in their everyday lives, because they are avoiding talking about their death because it's socially inappropriate, or they are afraid of upsetting their children, or they are afraid of upsetting themselves. This is a denial of agency because they would probably prefer to have the circumstances of their death outlined if they were capable, but their fear is preventing them from doing so. And fourthly, people lacking these agency is actually a really, really bad thing. Death is considered an important part of our lives. That is why so many religions and so many philosophies deal with things like questions of legacy, questions of what happens after death. People obviously care a lot about the circumstances in which they die, in which their life, which they value so much, is concluded. So it's very likely that it is an inherent good to increase the understanding surrounding death and give people more agency surrounding their death, in addition to the benefit of lessening suffering and lessening the amount that themselves and their family suffer in the circumstances of their death. Before I go on, opening.
Insofar as voluntary and advanced directive euthanasia exist on both sides, why don't they trigger the same conversations you talk about? Because they're thinking about death and how they want to evaluate death and all the stuff you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, conversations about voluntary euthanasia may exist on both sides, but that is simply, as I said in my mechanisms, not something people want to think about, right? People don't want to think about whether or not they're going to, suddenly die in a car accident and, what will they do with their money after they die in that car accident, the same way that they don't want to think about signing an advance directive. But what we do to increase agency is we get people to talk about death specifically as a binary choice between whether or not they, in that circumstance of them losing consciousness and them not being able to consent, whether or not they want someone else to make that choice for them, or whether or not they want to make that choice themselves. This is a clear choice between the two, And like no matter what people choose, this is an increase in agency. The reason why it's likely that people will actually make that choice and have those conversations is one, because that like there's probably going to be news everywhere about this kind of choice that they have to make. They'll probably have to have that conversation with the people who they imagine to be people making their choices for them. Second of all, there are probably a lot of people who, like as upbench, and like some people probably thinks that this this choice that other people is making for these people is disgusting and is like akin to murder or something. And that is the precise reason why the people would likely discuss with their families and likely do things like opt into the advance directive. But thirdly, governments and medical systems are probably incentivized to give these people the education to the max degree because they don't want situations in which this thing is framed as a murder because the person didn't previously know about this decision. And they will probably want to have people have those conversations with their loved ones. Yes?
Do you think people are rational about the future in general and their future specifically?
Well, our policy makes them more rational, and that's a good thing. Okay, so now people have to think about the different circumstances in which they die. They'll probably more likely do other things as well, apart from have those conversations or do advance directives, maybe write wills, maybe cut off family members who are likely to make bad decisions in those instances. The impacts of that, like fewer people die in undignified circumstances, far fewer family members are suffering for long periods of time because they know that the person like wasn't aware of the fact that wasn't aware of like different choices and they like don't have the mechanism to like stop the person from suffering. And there's also generally a healthier approach to death among people in society. Probably also reduces abuse by like manipulative individuals like self-help gurus or whatever who manipulate individuals because of their fear of death. Okay, second of all, we're just going to say that actually, the definition of death and the definition of people who have the ability to consent and who have the right to life is actually extremely slippery. For example, it was not until the 1960s and 1970s until the definition of brain death was invented. And previously, you were like literally not allowed to like, take people off the respirator if they have become in a vegetative state. So we believe since the person who we're talking about probably is in an irreversible medical condition or will never be conscious again, or is unlikely to be conscious again, it is probably okay for that person's consent to not be the person who is consenting, but rather someone else in their family who is suffering the most as a result of that person's circumstances. Very hard to
Hear, hear. I thank the Prime Minister for that speech, and I invite up the Leader of Opposition to open the floor for the opposition side of the House. Hear, hear.
Is everybody ready?
Yeah.
One moment. Sadia, if you wouldn't mind for time, we'll just make them extra loud so we can hear them this side too.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's curious that this opening government team cloaks their choice-annihilating rhetoric under the veil of agency, while simultaneously arguing to strip people of the very agency by robbing people of the capacity to control the most important decision they will ever be able to make, that is, whether or not to continue their existence in the material world. I'm going to first explain why their claims are both orthogonal to the debate and also out of the round, and then I'll explain why this choice principle is the most important thing in the debate before moving on to societal impacts. On framing, and this responds to opening government in total, I just think it's wrong when OG says that people don't consider end-of-life plans in status quo, and them asserting that people have a fear of death because it's not discussed in culture is not the same as providing mechanistic reasons for why this is true. This is because, trivially, in most cases where someone has a long-run illness like dementia or MS or Alzheimer's, it is likely that the discussion about what to do when the person becomes incapable of decision-making and might be suffering is had in advance by the person they're caretakers, if only because most people are somewhat moral actors and don't want to burden those people with having to make a decision about end-of-life care over a prolonged period of time, even if that person doesn't have the capacity to choose whether they live or die in the status quo. But there are a few other reasons for this. Firstly, these diseases tend to have somewhat longer time horizons, so there's somewhat time to cope and accept it and have time to discuss it. Very few deaths comparatively happen in things like freak accidents, so in the vast majority of cases where this would be relevant, informed consent can be obtained beforehand, and the status quo wherein it is perfectly legal and people know that it is perfectly legal to sign away their right to not be resuscitated at the point at which they are under a life or death situation, they can already do that. But secondly, people tend to have a revealed preference for planning the circumstances of their death. This is both to prepare their loved ones for it emotionally and psychologically, but also to prepare their loved ones for it financially. It can often be a huge financial strain to be taking care of a person, so necessarily those caretakers are likely to want to talk to you about your end-of-life plans over time time. They're likely not to have discussions as a family, both to prepare themselves emotionally for losing grandpa, but also to prepare themselves financially for the day that these things change and to discuss how financial plans happen year on year. But thirdly, people who are nearing end of life are likely to take advantage of the large amounts of end of life infrastructure that exists in developed democracies. Not only Norway and Sweden, right? Like Medicaid is one of the few things the US does right, and it is still pretty good at end of life care, and is still pretty good at informing people about these end of life choices. So I just don't think it's the case that people don't think about it. Finally, it's scalar, right? As you age, you are more likely to take death into account. I, as a young person, probably don't like to think about death very often because it's something quite unfortunate to me, and I'm very young and have few responsibilities in the world and feel like my entire life is ahead of me because the narrative is I'm young. When I am an old person, I have to think about that because I have to think about who's going to fill the position at work when I, die or resign. Who's going to do these kinds of things? It's double if I get diagnosed with a disease. The bottom line to all of this is, even if I don't want to think about these things, I have to at some point, and it's probably the case that, given the other forms of euthanasia still exist, as Ahmed's POI pointed out, they can trigger the same kinds of social discussions that Vivian wants to happen. But lastly, note that there's just a massive mechanistic gap at PM. Vivian's mech is that our culture doesn't talk or think about death much. I think this is curious because obviously it's scalar. As you get older, you talk about it more, as I said. But note importantly, if their mechanism is people in having this option are now likely to make better decisions about end-of-life care preemptively if this becomes a societal narrative, I think you can flip this very cleanly. It is very intuitive that if I know that I can allow my family members to make decisions about my death, and if Vivian is correct that some people fear death so much that they're going to put off discussing it or talking about it or writing a will, even though they know it burdens people around them to do so, they'll just shunt the decision off to their family members over time, and more on their side of the house, at the point at which it becomes a societal narrative, be acceptable. It also means that the vast majority of instances just aren't super relevant in this debate, because it's a minority of people in society that can't consent in advance, and it's a minority of people in society that are going to behave in this manner. Before I go on, opening.
If people are truly just fearing death and shunting the responsibility to their family members, whilst knowing that the family members could do this euthanasia to them, isn't that a form of consent?
Now, moving on. Let's talk about in context where it is important, or rather, if it is a form of consent, then it happens on our side, right? Because they can already preemptively sign that away. Why is it the case that in context where this is important, this is particularly important? And note this is often like freak accidents in a fairly small number of cases where people don't give consent in advance. So it's not like some broad sweeping societal change probably comes about this. This is probably a principle debate. Why is this the most important thing? We think that robbing people of choice and agency is really, really bad. This is because on a fundamental moral level, the only person affected by the life or death decision that should have the right to consent to end their life, and no approximation suffices, is the person themselves. There are 4 reasons for this. I realize that a lot of these judges are American, they don't like the word intuition pump, so I will facetiously avoid using it, but look, these are just reasons, they are principled reasons proving a principled impact. The first thing here is that it is impossible for any friend or family member you empower to make a decision on your behalf to say with epistemic certainty that this person would make the decision to end their life in these circumstances. That is because you lack access fundamentally to another person's interior world. That is to say, while I might have a pretty good approximation of what Ahmed might do because we're very good friends, I don't know with 100% certainty what decision he would make, especially in the emotionally heightened context where I'm unsure he can behave rationally like a life or death situation. That is to say, my reasonable approximation, due to this lack of epistemic certainty, is unlikely to be a fair or reasonable approximation for Ahmed, and unlikely to be reasonable to allow me to infer that. But secondly, the irreversibility of this choice. It is not a choice that can be undone. The reason experts defer to trans people when pursuing gender confirmation surgery for trans people is because only that person can be allowed to make a decision that has irreversible effects in their body. As another intuition to illustrate this, it's why we wouldn't allow someone to tattoo a sleeping friend. Like I can just draw a tattoo on Ahmed because I think, he might find that funny, and other friends say it's okay, because we recognize that's a gross breach of consent regardless. But finally, unknowability. Fundamentally, the person suffering cannot be aware of that decision, right? Because they cannot consent into it. So even if you think you know with 100% certainty what that person might want to do, note the context is likely to be one in which you're very removed from them. Because a freak accident or a long-term illness is not something everyone or even most people experience. So this can change the entire way that somebody might think, and it's very unlikely that your approximation to their decision is particularly impactful. Before I explain the final mechanism here, I'll take a POI for closing to engage.
In your extreme, everyone already talks about end-of-life plans to be moral actors early on in their life. If they've already created a decision on what they want to do in your side, what harm does non-voluntary active euthanasia actually create?
Listen to my case. In the vast majority of cases, there is no impact, because in the vast majority of cases, people do make end-of-life plans. In the context where this debate is relevant, i.e. freak accidents, some long-term illnesses, some people who are structurally ill-equipped to make long-term plans, our side is better, because abrogating a moral right for these people is a worse harm than having some few people better off. I think that is incredible. The final thing I wanted to start here is it fails a proportionality test. That is to say, any violation of consent has to be weighed against the harm or benefit of the person. In this case, the fail state of the motion is literal infinite utility harm. That is the maximum violation of autonomy, because once you're dead, that is the end of any ability for you to act autonomously, at least in this life. The intuition is that we consider other violations of consent to be scalar. That is, we think it's legitimate for the state to impose limitations on me driving too fast, but not to imprison me without cause and take away my rights, even if it is the case that I could rent some harm to a third party. Insofar as that is an intuition that we all hold in this room, I hope, it is probably the case that it is morally abhorrent to take that right away from those individuals. The impact of all this principled analysis is that even if it is the case that Gov can prove a small practical benefit, which I'm sure Shady will try to do, they'll try to say, for some people, this might make them somewhat better off. This principle matters more. Imagine a society, panel, in which many different people had their preferences fulfilled, but some people were killed against their will at different intervals. We would consider that society to be utterly barbaric, so much so that Suzanne Collins wrote The Hunger Games about just such a society. I think that world is barbaric. I don't think it's a world I want to live in. I think I'm incredibly proud to win from opening up.
Yeah, the windows are.
This one, I think a lot of them are open. Yeah, this one's like marginally open and feels tunnel, but it's, I don't know how to. It sounds right here. Yeah.
I think you just have to push them from the top.
I can try to. I count my abilities, but I believe in you. Oh, is that? Sorry.
I think it's fine. I think it's fine.
Sounds like it worked.
I thank the leader of opposition. I invite up the deputy prime minister to the floor. You're here.
I'm actually just
I mean, you don't have notes to worry about.
Exactly.
Do it wherever you
Right now I
want.
can't see Susanna's laptop at all, so.
That's true. Yeah, I think it's somewhere like this.
Is everybody good? Most of us would agree, or all of us would agree, that there's a point after which life is no longer worth living. We may disagree about the specific point that is, but we understand that when you're suffering so much that you're no longer able to make conscious choices, when you're under such intense pain of being plugged to a machine that you have no ability to opt into because you never chose to be in this accident or you never chose to have dementia, that is a world in which you are already stripped of consent. I think the thing that opening opposition misunderstands is that this is not only a debate about consent and who maximizes consent, but rather a debate about a world in which consent is no longer possible. In that world, opening government is very proud to supporting the minimization of suffering, which is the entire point of having somebody who cares about you and loves you to make this decision on your behalf. I'm going to do a few simple things in the speech. First, I'll talk a bit about consent, why we still optimize for that, even though maybe it's not the absolute most important thing in this issue. It's still quite important, and all the responses to opening opposition will be integrated. And finally, I want to talk about the principle of minimizing suffering, and also how that weighs up against a situation in which you're suffering so much you're no longer able to make any kind of choice whatsoever. So what opening opposition says is that a lot of the times you can have these conversations in advance. I want to note what this argument does. This argument maybe mitigates some of the cases to which our argumentation could apply, but it does not minimize every single case. Insofar as there are still freak accidents to be had, which there are still very fast-moving diseases that people could progress really fast through and not be able to have that conversation with their families, that the progression of the disease is so traumatizing, or even individuals who maybe are suffering under long-standing diseases that could be motivated to have those conversations with their families, but push it off for other emotional reasons. Insofar as we tip the scales and allow some people to make those choices, we think that if you support consent to any kind of consent argumentation whatsoever, you should vote for our side. Because they say that what's important in this debate is the fundamental moral level here. We think that car accident victims are quite important. I don't know, every time you get into a car, you have a 1 in 5,000 chance of getting into a car accident. A lot of people get into car accidents every single year, but nobody actually thinks it's going to happen to you. So we don't think it's a very strange edge case. But even if it is, we think that those people should be still pressured to have those conversations with their families, should be still pressured to make an advanced decision, because, and here I will provide the tipping point analysis for why it is the case that voluntary advanced euthanasia is actually not adequate in the status quo. One, I think like sort of intuitively, nobody else knew about it until we read the info slide. So even though we're all motivated to start thinking about death and to start thinking about these questions, it is not something that we want to think about. So maybe it is a legal technicality, but we're not actively incentivized to seek this out in the status quo. What does this policy change, and what does Vivian bring to you? You bring other parties into it. Now, it spurs discourse that is careful and moderated, not only because it makes huge news headlines, the point at which every media outlet might report on, like the family that chose to end their loved one's life and talk about the ethics of that, but moreover, you have to talk with so many people now. You not only have to make a single conversation with one family member, because there's probably going to be a lot of legislative pressure to make sure that people are not just willy-nilly abusing this power. You're probably going to have processes in place where you interview multiple family members, because most Western liberal democracies value human life and want to make sure that the plug is pulled only when this person is absolutely suffering, and that these family members have adequate reason to believe this is what the person would genuinely want. So not only is it a requirement for you to have careful and moderated talks with so many people, but your families now pressure you, right? Like our families probably love us to some degree, where our guardians love us to some degree, and they are scared of making the wrong choice because they care about you and they care about your health. They want to ensure that they're making the choice that you would like. And even if that choice veers towards prolonging your life longer than is necessary, because they genuinely do love you and they want to veer on the side of caution, that is still better than the status quo, because in the status quo, people have no ability to choose, and they just simply suffer for an incredibly long time before the plug is inevitably pulled on them, and they don't have a good quality of life whatsoever. I'll take a POI if back half has one. Oh, sorry, Nature. Opening?
If your principle is you want to minimize suffering at all costs, you have to recognize that this is not an absolute right. If it were true that people should minimize suffering at the cost of agency, we'd throw people in jail at random in high crime areas in order to deter crime. Obviously, we don't do that, so the agency of people is something about prioritizing these contexts, even if you minimize somewhat more suffering, which we can test.
Okay, so I don't think you heard the first part, which is agency already doesn't exist in this situation. And we're not talking about, there's clearly a bright line here, right? Because we're not just throwing people in jail for whatever reason. It is having such a high barrier for what counts as immense suffering, because everybody in society is going to be brought into this conversation when you make this kind of legislation. There's a lot of mechanisms for legal recourse and to change the legal system. Everybody, for reasons that you said, they do value life, which is why we think structurally speaking there will be incredibly high bar to how much suffering is allowed before this kind of thing becomes possible. Like, you have to be totally incapacitated, comatose. There has to be, probably beyond a reasonable doubt that you're never going to be able to have consent ever again. So when you're in that kind of situation, what happens therefore? We believe that in this kind of circumstance, your suffering should be ended, and you have no claim to agency because that already does not exist. Why? Because agency, principally speaking, is facilitative. We believe that people should be agents and should be able to make choices that benefit them, because we believe that each person knows how to make their life better. The problem is now that you are in such pain and suffering and unconsciousness that you are, structurally speaking, incapable of making any of those choices whatsoever. So, given that in these situations, people are unable to choose on both sides of the house, we must default to the principle of minimizing suffering, because that is also a balance that we hold to be true and that we believe people should have an ability to opt into. Back half.
Does everybody, status quo, have agency all the time?
No, but if we don't have agency all the time, we should still ideally, even if there's a benevolent dictator, let's say nobody has agency, right? I would prefer the person who is making my choices to make choices that make me really happy as opposed to make me really sad. I don't think it's really difficult to understand. Lastly, talking just 2 more points about epistemic certainty. It is impossible by the same decision over time as well, because under this metric, under their side of the house, advanced directives are also wrong as well. Lastly, ending life, all the stuff about ending life being the ultimate violation of consent, we believe that the value of life is quite scalar. Killing a person who will die tomorrow is very different from killing a 20-year-old, and we believe that the situation falls under the extreme of when this person is no longer ever able to recover from this kind of disease. At the end of the day, we believe this is still a principal debate, and what should you weigh here? We believe that you should try to maximize the consent of individuals who are able to choose, to spur more discussions, to make sure that the barrier for euthanasia is much, much, much higher. But more importantly, we also do believe that when you are comatose and that there is already a high legal standard for never being able to consent again, we must default to other metrics beyond consent, like the minimization of suffering, making sure that people who are under a situation in which they can never experience the joys of life again manage to be able to escape this mortal hell.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister, invited the DLO, and just want to make sure whoever's phone that was. That's what. All right, no worries. That's okay. You can do it to yourself. All right. whenever you are.
3, 2, 1. No matter how beautiful and well crafted a coffin may look, it will never make anyone wish for death. I want to take out the societal view that we get from OG or the societal impacts that we get and get to the actual meat and crux of the debate as to whether or not this is principally justified. This isn't a tipping point insofar as previous and alternative legislation literally gets us the exact same things that they're talking about, i.e. advanced directive euthanasia, voluntary euthanasia, other legislation on wills and power of attorney. These do the exact same thing on all their mechanisms, doctors, people who think this choice is disgusting, etc., because it tackles the central question that is the source of that conversation, i.e. what should we do after death, what causes death, how should we think about it. But I'm going to flip it. If it's not legal, they have to consider the potential because they won't be able to make that choice on their side. So they consider those conversations even more and consider having advanced directives of particular scenarios before the unlikely might happen. So in other words, they take the onus substantially more on our side insofar as they think that the onus may never otherwise be given to them. Secondarily, also note the incentives of media and filmmakers to have uncomfortable but interesting conversations to attract wide audiences means there's probably enough conversations about death that are quite nuanced. This isn't an actual thing in the debate. Now, the next thing I want to rebut that's extraneous thing before getting into weighing is that the harm of death is scalar. This is incredibly silly. Insofar as we wouldn't charge murderers less if they massacred a nursing home instead of an infant ward, there's probably an infinite value that is associated with death and killing someone insofar as they did not consent into that death. So notice for example, like this choice is one in which you are actively taking the life of someone. It is not random happenstance that an old person died and therefore the value of the future years would have been less or more than if they were younger. Now, why is this different from other decisions we allow where we strip autonomy like power of attorney or where someone cannot consent or is fulfilling somebody's will? Firstly, the irreversibility of death. Other decisions to some degree are reversible in time, i.e. your estate donation can be taken back or you can appeal it once you get better. You cannot come back from dying. If you know, let me know. Secondarily, it's impossible to adjudicate preferences relative to death. And this is critical. We can understand that an individual might want to donate their estate to various places based on their revealed preference, or they wanted their kids to operate a company or something. Note the info slide explicitly excludes scenarios where the person does consent before the fact, so they have not consented to this on their side. What does this mean? Death versus suffering is impossible for someone to adjudicate. Why? Because no one can ever verbalize the harm or fear of the option of death because they've never experienced it, and it's fundamentally unknowable. Why does this matter further on? One, this is a decision that government cannot point to an analogy in society, but secondarily, it engages with Gov on the argument that there is no consent possible. Because yes, you cannot consent into the serious debilitating suffering they're talking about. I don't disagree with that. But you also cannot consent into death. So what does this then make for all of their principal arguments? This means that at their best and our worst, this would be a wash. Because on either side, you are forcing a consent into something in which you don't know is better or worse or not. So their whole principled analysis is that a wash at this point. Let me make it not a wash now, but I'll give them a POI.
Right. So in your case, you already say that you support active voluntary euthanasia. So you clearly believe that there's some point afterwards life is no longer worth living and people can make that choice.
No, I believe people individually can make that choice for themselves, but not that anybody else can make that society whether or not they choose to die or not, because you can never reveal that preference to anyone else. And if you could, you did it beforehand, which is not in the scope of this debate. Why do weigh agency over the potential minimization of their harm? Let's take at their best that this will in fact minimize harm. Death is the sweeter option, it's bliss. The agency of the individual matters substantially more. How do I characterize agency for you though? Agency doesn't have to be the fulfillment of a decision, but also respect to not fulfill someone's decisions on someone's behalf. Their agency not to choose something over another and force them into making that choice. So it can be active, but also negative. Why then do you not weigh on utility harm? Utility is impossible to aggregate amongst people because one, people perceive harms and benefits differently by virtue of being different human beings. At a biological level, they perceive harm very differently. At a moral preferential level, they perceive death and the cost or utility and utile harms very differently based on their beliefs. Fourthly, utility is dynamic and it changes over time based on someone's preferences and interactions with the world. And fifthly, there's an inability for humans to communicate all of their utile preferences properly insofar as language barriers exist for deep emotions and people don't always communicate all of their thoughts that are stuck in their head because you cannot tell everyone at every point what you're thinking. What does this mean? The comparative on agency is that everyone would prefer to make their own decisions from that veil of ignorance. That is to say, the assumed preference of every single human being on the planet is, I would like to make my own decisions. If you ask them from decisions about what, I don't know what the outcomes are, but I would want to make my own decisions. What this does is it tells you that the minimization of harm is not the metric you should use, but rather the assumed preference that everybody has versus the uncommunicable preferences that they depend on their side. But also, there are situations where people cannot reasonably consent, but we also don't strip their agency. I.e., children can't consent into being raised religious, but we don't ban religion or force them to be a religion that might be in the best interest for them. The upshot of all of this is that yes, you have to strip agency on both sides. But the question is not based on the utile harm, but rather you are making an active decision for someone in which we've explained why you ought not to, or people would prefer that decision not be made for them, insofar as you cannot communicate those utile preferences. Before getting into the last piece of weight, if by nothing that I've said before that back half.
If you're never going to be conscious or regain memory, why does the irreversibility of these impacts matter? Because the effect can't even be comprehended by your current brain status.
Because people who are debilitating and suffering still are conscious beings. That is to say, they can still feel things, and also the point is they might want to exist further or have any sort of spiritual beliefs as to whether or not they should or should not have their family kill themselves. The point is that death is something incredibly massive and an important fundamental decision that you cannot make for them. But secondarily, on the act omission distinction, on either side, you have to make some sort of decision that may violate their preference. Gov, maybe they don't want to die. Our side, maybe they did want to die and they're suffering. How do you break this deadlock? It is better to not act than to act when equally certain moral harms are likely. Why is it better not to act versus to act? When you act, you take full culpability and responsibility of that moral harm. The comparative is when you don't act, the universe shares some culpability for that action in that situation. Here's an intuition pump to make it simple. If there is a drowning child, if I don't act to save that drowning child, maybe it's bad. But the drowning child would have still drowned because the universe placed them there in some instance. That is very different than if I acted and threw the fucking kid into the water and he drowned. Because the universe didn't make that happen. I did. The upshot of all of this is a very, very sensitive ethical question. We either have to act that may violate someone's preference or not act and it still may violate someone's preference. So in this uncertain ethical dilemma, I've told you why it is likely the more preferable moral option to not act. Don't put them in the coffin if they didn't ask for it.
I thank the DLO for that speech. I invite up the member of government to open the floor for closed calf. Hear, hear.
OWA gives you a lot of beautiful reasons for consent, but this debate is about consent is violated either way, but who makes a decision for you? This is the reason, because in the cases in which an advance directive is acquired, the people will be making decisions for themselves on either sides of the house, but they're still making a decision. There's no epistemic uncertainty that living is good, that suffering is good. It's also irreversible that dementia will erode my brain even more and erode my identity if they let me continue and let me survive in that case as well. This is the difference. The government is making a blanket decision once and for all for every single person in their situation, versus we give it to the next best actor who are the family members who can gauge your preferences more and understand what you're going into. Consent is violated on either side of the house. They haven't proven to you why the government can just decide once and for all that living is always better regardless of suffering, and that's why our moral obligation is way better fulfilled. It's not about consent or not consent, but when consent cannot apply, our moral obligation is to give it to the next best actor, and this is what CG is going to prove to you, why family members are the next best actor who's going to likely make the best decision. But the second extension that we're going to bring to you on top of that is, even if it's true that yourself is the only person who can make consensual decisions, then we have the incentives to make structural adjustments to make advanced directives more acquired in situations or more mandated, and that still helps us arrive at the ending of consent. This is why OJ is mostly out of the round, because the delta on discourse is very unclear. Like, life insurance companies are constantly trying to get you to think about your end of the life plans. People are like, lawyers want you to write wills so they can like charge more hours and stuff like that. All these things are pushing
pushing narratives of death and planning for yourself. We're unsure why one decision about euthanasia, when advanced directives exist, will make a massive difference. The delta is just very small or marginal or unclear. We're going to do, first of all, talk about family members. It is in OG's model. We're unsure why it wasn't really discussed, why family members, when they're such important actors in this debate, but we're going to prove two things under this first extension. One, family members make good decisions. Here are a few reasons. One, exactly because of what O said about subjective preferences and stuff like that. If anyone can at least gauge that a little bit, it's your family members who live with you day in and day out. They also observe you make other smaller medical decisions for yourself, like surgery and stuff like that. So you better understand what is your risk averse and risk-loving levels for all these reasons. This is things like pain tolerance, or how much zest they have for their current life, the way of the quality of life. They can prove to you why the government will make a better decision when it comes to all these subjective medical decisions to just once and for all say living is better than just dying in this case in a more painless way. Two, your families are the ones who are taking care of you, financially and physically. So they're the only ones who can gauge your quality of life after the surgery. The doctor can tell you what the procedure looks like and the recovery period, but only family members can predict how painful that period will actually be, because how many months can they pay for you to live in the ICU? How much time can they dedicate to take you to physical therapy or to help you with all these things and to take care of you if you have dementia? That means the quality of life can only be gauged by those who are the primary caretakers, which are the family members of this patient in this case, so they have that information uniquely. But thirdly, they have massive incentive to make the correct decision. They're only worried about one case at a time. They will live with this decision forever because they love you. That's all mental capacity and incentive to really care about what they're doing, versus doctors day in and day out, they deal with a lot of things. Governments also disperse their energy across a lot of policy issues. Incentive-wise, families also have the strongest incentive to make the best decision. So we've proven to you that families make good decisions for patients. But two, we're going to prove that they have the right to decide. And this is the reason. Because this decision actually affects the patient a lot less than it affects the family members acutely in terms of the quality of life. Let's talk about that first part first. Why does it affect the patient very little? This is for two reasons. One, they're already debilitated by the pain of the suffering when this conversation is even brought up. If there are preferences, sure, it's subjective, but when you're in so much pain, you can't really act on your preferences or think about your preferences because it takes over. Our survival instincts means pain is the only thing we feel for a reason. But two, my grandma recently went through this, so I know that when you can't even indicate your preference by moving your fingers, and the fact that audio is one of the last things to go for to hear a choice and then just indicate by twitching your finger which one you want, it means most of your nervous system has already deteriorated. So it means pain is actually not that felt. You're usually just in a coma or a vegetated state in which you cannot express anything. So the pain in this, for the decision of euthanasia doesn't affect your agency a whole ton when your nervous system has mostly deteriorated already. But this affects family a whole deal. Because one, it is the time they have to take to fundamentally change your lifestyle to take care of you. But two, in a capitalist system, medical bills are so expensive that it means trading off the life quality with other family members. Going to school, the transportation, shelter, rent, and stuff like that. There is an opportunity cost in terms of other people's quality of life that is very, very visceral. And the fact that you will have to live with guilt and stuff like that with this decision, all that means that this affects family members a lot more on this side of the house. So actually they have the right to decide because their consent and their quality of life is being threatened way more as well. Opening.
Even if you prove family members make utile decisions, this does not win the debate. Many people live lives of absolute suffering in circumstances like war or slavery. It is equally analogous to having a very deep illness you might not recover from. It's still illegitimate to kill them. You don't have a right to determine the price of
First of all,
someone's life.
if your argument is about consent, family members' consent are also being violated when their lifestyle is subject to that much change. They have a stake in the game, and they make good decisions. Utility is always good. But moreover, the application of consent is just not absolute. If we could have gotten the person to consent themselves, that's the best case. There's no debate. This debate is the government a better actor to violate consent or family members? You still haven't done any work on that comparative on your side of the house. So when we prove to you that consent is actually better applied because this is the next trustworthy actor, like with a child, if a child is going to surgery, we don't just make a blanket statement without the context, rather the parent consents. It's for the same reason that this should be extended to your family members in this case as well. Moving on to the second argument about why we improve procedures for acquiring advanced directives because we change the incentive of hospitals on our side of the house. This is what our world looks like. When you expect a family to need to make decisions about euthanasia, you think it could be messy if they regret their decision and they want to come after you and stuff like that, if they regret the unintended effects of their decision and stuff like that. Yeah, closing.
I'm waiting to hear the analysis, I'll respond to that later, but why is this not also going to fall to all of the stuff about voluntary euthanasia now exists as well?
No, yeah, I would tell you why hospitals have a bigger incentive to push for advanced directives. That's my argument. So, if they're worried about this back and forth, they know that euthanasia is part of the equation because your family members will come in and make the decision anyway. They'll be like, if I can acquire the advanced directive, it's so much easier for me, so they will push for it to be in the system. For example, in a health checkup, you will indicate like at what level would you consent to like unplugging yourself and stuff like that. Doing more general questionnaires and normal medical procedures, because then they can acquire more advanced directives and not need to worry about this down the line because they know families are not part of the equation and could bring you legal trouble down the line. But in their world, there's no impetus for this for two reasons. One, it's very agreeable to just prolong someone's life. Like when you didn't have an advanced directive, the default answer is just I prolong someone's life. No complicatedness regarding that. There's no reason for me to complicate my medical system and scare my patient by talking about euthanasia and like dying and stuff like that. But two, it also aligns with the hospital's interest because you can charge more money if the default is just to prolong their life, put them on the ventilators, put them on expensive drugs and stuff like that. There's no impetus to ask for more advanced directives when the decision you make to prolong your life is not going to be questioned on either side. So when families come in to meddle the situation, that's when you change the hospital's incentives and say, if I get an advanced directive, my job is easier. There's going to be less legal disputes and stuff like that. So even in O's best case, that consent can only be given by the self, which they don't even prove. We still win when we get that structural improvement for advanced directives. So proud to be LSE.
I thank the member of government. I invited the member of opposition. Hear, hear.
Panel's ready? Look, I'll engage in the principal debate later, but it's not going to be my primary focus because this is not a principal debate. The government is taking a major symbolic step to allow family members to kill other family members in a break with centuries of medical tradition and the cultural placement on the value of life. Obviously, this has some real world fucking impacts that we should be discussing. I'm going to go into those later. Firstly, responses to CG. The stuff about how this affects family members I will deal with later. That will directly clash material I have on why this is more traumatic to family members when you present them with this choice. But on the last case about improving procedures to get an advanced directive, 3 responses. Firstly, it's really unclear that this is at the top of a doctor's mind and they're going out their way to get this information when they're dealing with tens, if not hundreds of patients a day when they have to see different medical conditions. Secondly, it doesn't deal with the freak incident stuff. That is to say, there are plenty of instances where it's not clear that you're going to ever need an advanced directive. Thirdly, this just will exist when voluntary euthanasia exists. Insofar as this protects you from lawsuits and knowing how people want to be treated and how they want their lives to end, when there is the ability to give active advanced directives, as we agree is non-comparative on this side of the house, then it also exists for doctors to, the incentive for doctors to get that also exists. What am I going to do? Firstly, why people will generally, at a general level, disengage away from medicine and seeking treatment. Secondly, why this is deeply traumatic to all involved. Thirdly, the principal stuff. On general disengagement from medicine. The claim here is that this changes the view of the medical profession massively, from life-saving to life-taking. Why? One, at the point where you do this policy, you will just get religious and other attacks. Religious attacks and from other people who value life a lot. Why? This is similar to calling people who, calling doctors who carry out abortions murderers. They are now seen to be actively taking life by allowing people to turn a button off to hasten people's end. Secondly, it will require a fundamental rewrite of all of our medical codes of ethics, which say do no harm, but you are now actively doing a harm by removing people's ability to continue living. Thirdly, that shows that doctors no longer care about your consent specifically, which is what I think will prove through the principle, which is to say that if doctors are now able to say, we don't actually care about what you as the individual think, I'm going to go to your family members instead, then that signals that medical professions, to at least some extent, no longer value your consent in the way that they once did. I would note here that people are uniquely irrational about life and about medical intervention. Why? One, they are incredibly protective of their bodies because it is the thing that allows them to do everything that they enjoy within life. It is their ability to live out their agency. Secondly, most people are not trained in the medical complexities of the body. Like most people do not have degrees in medicines and therefore have to put a degree of blind trust. But thirdly, that degree of blind trust is going into a stranger who you don't know what they think, you don't know what their preferences and their incentives are, etc. But fourthly, life is just so valuable at an intrinsic level that I don't think this debate is engaged with beyond the cultural, which is literally ingrained into us in the flight or flight response, in our desire, in like the theory of evolution, etc., which means that we are always looking to avoid death. What are the impacts of all of that then at the point where the medical profession is being attacked as taking life and people are uniquely irrational about their lives? It means that people are just less likely to come forward for treatment because irrationally they're going to think, oh dear God, what is this doctor going to do to me? What are my family going to allow this doctor to do to me? Sure, they'll trade that off with the risk to their life of not coming forward, but given all the stories you get in the media about this person that survived cancer because they drank a glass of orange juice a day, or people who just become well because they survived common colds, etc., I think they'll probably take the risk of avoiding the stranger who holds all of this information that they do not have. I think the impacts of that is just more death, more trauma, more debilitation, because people do not come forward for treatment when they start to disengage from medicine. Before I go on to the second claim, OG.
Religious people also hate abortion, calling it like involuntary euthanasia, and all of your arguments like a lack of trust apply. Why the medical system
yes,
hasn't
but this
passed
only,
laws?
okay, listen up. This only applies to certain people in the status quo, in like the abortion industries, i.e. people who are having children. When the government does this at a symbolic level and says anybody at any point, if they end up in this situation, could lose their life, that is the point where every single person has to think about it and it becomes a tipping point. Secondly, this is deeply traumatic to all involved. Status quo, people who are the family members are in very difficult situations, obviously, given the freak accidents or the illnesses or whatever that's happened. But status quo, they can rationalize it. Why? Because one, they're able to say that nothing can be done, i.e. they have to be in the coma, there's no other form of policy option available to doctors. Secondly, they're able to say it's not their fault. They had no hand in the illness, they had no hand in the freak accident, they have no ability to dictate treatment, etc., or the end of life. But thirdly, they're able to hold on to an irrational hope. That is to say, maybe tomorrow's a day where there's a medical breakthrough and my family member will wake up. That's what allows them to cope and allows them to keep living despite what is obviously a difficult situation. At the point where this policy goes into place, you strip people of that ability to cope and all those messages because you place the decision of the future in their hands. They no longer can disassociate from this. They can't shirk those decisions because they're directly placed into their hands. That means they now have to grapple with, am I going to end the life of my family member or not? That is not something you can rationalize your way out of because that is an active choice that you have to take. It greatly exacerbates the trauma and removes your ability to cope, which is even more debilitating to family members, flipping closing governments. And on that, I will take CG.
If they don't want it to be their fault, they can still make the decision to not opt for euthanasia or send a house. But there are also people who prioritize massive death.
But that doesn't
and
engage the analysis,
otherwise.
right? The analysis is the problem comes as a result of giving them the choice. They now have to actively make a choice whether to keep people in misery in coma or put them out of their misery and end their lives. When you don't give them the choice, regardless of what the choice is, that's when they're able to cope. Listen to the analysis as given. Lastly, on the principle, I think Matt and Ahmed do prove well that it's difficult to consent, but two problems. One, it's contingent upon stripping agency to some degree, and as Gubbencha pointed out, you cannot strip agency from people who cannot actually think, actually rationalise out a thought to make an agency think. But secondly, there just are instances status quo where we do exercise agency on behalf of other people and trade off their agency, e.g. children, e.g. people with severe illness, dementia, etc. That means that their principle works when they're doesn't work when they're taking away agency from someone who doesn't have agency. It needs more nuance to it. The nuance to it is the following. One, the policy assumes perfect information. Sometimes doctors just are wrong, even with checks and balances. Secondly, it assumes perfect medical knowledge, and OG themselves admit that we didn't know about brain death until the 1950s. That just means that you are, on some occasions, going to kill people who would otherwise have survived. That is the link that explains why you are actively removing agency from people, but also just killing innocent people in a few minority of circumstances in gut bench, which they now also have to trade off.
I thank the member of opposition. I invite up the Gov whip to close out the Gov side of the debate. Hear, hear.
An extremely simple and important contribution from closing government. We tell you why family members can and should be able to make the best decision for you in the case where you're not able to do so. We give you 3 reasons why this is the case. Firstly, we tell you that your family members are the only ones who are able to understand your subjective preferences, given they know your risk levels, things like your spiritual preferences that OO wanted to talk about, things that the government will never know. Maybe you wanted to die in those situations, but the government says you just cannot do so. We are able to maximize the preference fulfillment and thus maximize your agency on our side. But secondly, and most importantly, something that none of the other teams in this round touch upon, is the fact that after this happens, your family and your loved ones are the ones who have to deal with the financial and care decisions regarding your life. These decisions can only be made by your family. That intimately affects them as well as you. Given that they have the most information about this, there is an asymmetry of information regarding this, as well as the fact that only they can judge your quality of life. They should be able to have the right to make these decisions. Finally, we tell you not only why they can make these best decisions, but why there's a moral obligation to give this right to these individuals. This means that we prove not only that the family is capable of doing so, but beating back claims regarding abuse that the opposition branch wanted to talk about, but we also take on a higher burden than what opening government does by telling you that the family has a right to make a decision regarding this matter, that they should be able to, given how it intimately affects their emotional state, their financial ability as well. Why then do we take it over OG in this round? I think firstly, we prove to you this higher burden, the stronger reason for why your family is actually able to make these decisions, given the knowledge that they have. But secondly, they talk about why discourse with your family members is important and why they're able to get this on their side of the house. But we prove the actual link as to why this discourse leads to meaningful change. Jackie talks to you about how you get stronger norms on our side of the house in terms of the system of advanced directives. This means that people are better able to make informed decisions regarding this matter, and in cases where they were not able to make these such decisions, your family members have the most information possible to make these sorts of decisions. So if CEO wants to talk about the idea that some individuals might find it traumatizing to make these sorts of decisions, they have a greater incentive now to speak to their family members early on in life about what sorts of decisions they might want to make, whether they want to create an advanced directive, etc. We think that given this is true, you're able to make a better decision for yourself, or your family members are better able to make a decision for you, rather than a situation where you're legally unable to make any decision whatsoever. I'm going to respond to closing opposition first and then move on to opening opposition. Firstly, then on CO. I think on this argument that this breaks with medical norms, I think firstly this is just not the case given that family members can already unplug you from a ventilator. It is unclear the meaningful difference here is. But secondly, to minimize legal risk, we tell you that there's more regular evaluation that's likely to happen on our side of the house, which means you get more information regarding your medical situation, and it means that you're actually able to make more fair decisions in terms of medical norms as well. But thirdly, it's unclear why breaking with these sorts of norms is bad insofar as the medical profession and knowledge regarding science changes a lot over time. It means that we need to reform based on what we are changing understanding of ethics as well as science as well. On their argument that there's going to be backlash, I think backlash is an illegitimate reason to avoid reform. The POI that OG gives you about abortion explains exactly what this looks like. We allow things anyways, and we should legalize this based on whether or not it is ethical. Doctors sign things like a Hippocratic oath anyways in order to ensure that individuals have the best treatment possible. It should not matter whether or not religious groups or spiritual groups are going to backlash against this. Finally, on the only content I think they really have, which is this idea that it's going to be deeply traumatic for these individuals. I think firstly, on the idea that people are able to rationalize it, it is unclear that people actually want to be able to rationalize it, insofar as for a lot of people, lack of control is also a deeply traumatizing experience. To feel like your family member is going through the most painful period in your life and you can't do anything, you're more likely to feel more rageful against the system, leading to worse outcomes in terms of the healthcare system in the long term. But secondly, the ability to cope doesn't overcome the huge time and financial burden that you have to deal with. It is not enough to say, okay, you can sit there and think about the fact that you had no ability to do anything after you've had to spend the dozens and hundreds of hours taking care of this person and having to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars that you don't have. Not everyone has the luxury to be able to deal with this, and the ability to cope does not solve the time and financial burdens that these individuals have. But secondly, it might also be deeply traumatizing for these individuals to experience the guilt of not feeling like they're a good caretaker. This is symmetric at best from closing opposition. If people think this will be deeply traumatic, if anything, they will make sure to have these discussions with their family members and doctors early on, since they know this is a legal option that their family member might take on, which strengthens Jackie's argument that we're going to have stronger legal norms on our side of the house, do things like yearly checkups, and gain more medical information on our side. Closing.
Given that you can't perfectly predict every scenario that might happen to you, that means whilst your family might have good information, it is still not perfect information. That means there will always be the crippling self-doubt in them of what if I made the wrong decision and accidentally killed my loved one.
If they have crippling self-doubt, they will just choose not to make a decision. It is unclear why it is bad for you to provide someone with an extra option, given that in a lot of situations they might think that they know what their family member wants, or even if they don't think they know what their family members want, they're able to judge what the quality of life will be afterwards, given that they have asymmetric information that no one else has about what the quality of life will be during that caretaking period. Okay, on opening opposition. I think the issue here is that they talk about agency very broadly a lot, but it's unclear why the only thing that matters is consent to death and not consent to suffering. On our side of the house, at least death is net neutral in terms of absence of suffering, but on their side of the house, it is net positive in terms of suffering when you have a debilitating illness and you're forced to put up with this. It is unclear why consent to death is the only thing that matters. Consent to suffering, we tell you, also matters. But secondly here, medical guidelines will be constructed as to when the suffering is high enough for this sort of policy of like non-voluntary active euthanasia to actually kick in, which means that they can determine when you don't have enough consciousness to exercise autonomy. Like, look at the info slide. The examples that are given are things like coma and dementia, where you don't have a significant amount of consciousness or the ability to regain your memory. Doctors are able to determine that this is a situation that you're in. If you're never going to be conscious or regain memory, the irreversibility of these impacts don't matter insofar as the effects cannot be even comprehended or experienced by your physical body and the situation in your body. Opening.
You can mitigate and minimize suffering, or in some cases reverse it, but not death. This is why family members, who, as Alex pointed out, lack access to that people's decision-making, cannot reasonably approximate a decision as central to them. All of the norms clashing in this debate is very much symmetric. This is the only thing that matters, and it was cleanly proven.
Yeah, so you can mitigate the harms of pneumonia, but we're not saying that you should pursue active, non-voluntary euthanasia in these cases. Doctors are obviously going to be deciding based on medical guidelines when this kicks in. So this is about like the most extreme cases, i.e. coma and dementia, that were mentioned in the info slide, where we don't think you're actually able to practice this. I also think there's a lack of conception of what agency actually is coming out of opening opposition. Agency is your ability to have a rational capacity to make decisions for yourself. In a coma, you don't have this. You're not stripping someone of agency insofar as this science and biology has already unfortunately stripped you of this. Going off this idea of like the definition of like a death moving from like a heartbeat to brain death, etc. We accept that we are not obligated to fulfill all of your preferences, spiritual or otherwise, after your death, with these varying definitions of death changing over time, insofar as it stops affecting you. Agency is not a 0 or 100. The state undermines your agency in a lot of ways, so should think about how to maximize your agency given the circumstances that biology has already undermined you of agency. When you can't decide, your family members have the ability to decide, and they are most intimately affected, so they ought to have the right to do so.
I thank the Gov Whip. I invite up the Op Whip to close the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Starting with opening government, going on to closing government, and then on to opening opposition. First of all, I think on what opening government brings on their idea of like creating a better conversation around death in a social environment, I think it's just slightly confusing because in their MEC they already say that voluntary advanced directives are already legal. I actually think this is a much bigger conversation starter than having an act, like making a choice even if it is non-voluntary. Because I want to be clear, like passive euthanasia, and this is not really clear in the info slide, passive euthanasia is when you turn off the machine, like you're on life support, you turn off the machine. Active euthanasia is when you inject them and you kill them. That is what I want to make clear. Passive euthanasia exists in basically every single country in the world. Active euthanasia does not, and neither does advanced directives either. However, making an advanced directive then legal in the first place, which they do in their MEC, is a big deal in themselves because you have now chosen to say people can consent to killing themselves further into the future. That is a much bigger conversation starter given that, like, you know, narratives around suicide are seen as like a much more of a tragedy and a sin. This is what triggers the conversation, not that now you can make that choice, because effectively the difference between active non-voluntary euthanasia and passive non-voluntary euthanasia, at least in a media sphere, would seem less like a big deal and not as like meaningful as like, you know, being able to kill yourself and being government mandated. So I think for like any of those discussions on death has already happened, and the beginning of the MEC doesn't fall under this motion specifically. Cool. Going on to closing government, right? They say, oh, your family has to live this decision, so they will make the correct decision. They say they love you and they will feel guilty and live with this guilt forever. Therefore, you don't kill them. You don't force them into euthanasia or anything. But if the family is already going to make this decision, why not already have the government make the exact same decision anyway and not put them through any of the emotional turmoil, because the end impacts are exactly the same on both sides of the house. They then say, oh, but there might be a case when actually the family will do it, despite how much they love you and the guilt they'll feel because of, you know, you need to make the right decision because you have financial burdens and physical burdens for looking after them. But this means there will always be an influence for you to want to kill your family, right? This gives you an effective monetary incentive to always kill your family in places where you have to pay for healthcare because you're effectively saving or making money by killing them. That means that you should always have an incentive to end somebody's life. This should not be ever governmentally mandated as somewhere like, or there should not be legal mechanisms within in the government for it to be an incentive to end somebody's life, even if it is the right thing, because then it is much more likely to be done for malicious means. I know, oh gee, somewhat mixed some of the stuff being like, oh, we'll do checks and balances, but in a place like America, there will always be financial things, even if you genuinely do think it is for their best interest, that cannot be distinguishable with the fact that it also save them £100,000 a year from not having them on life support in a coma. So I think actually, yes, governments will always make the better decision. They say, oh, but governments don't do this. Parents consent for children, even when and the government doesn't make the decisions. I think in a lot of countries this isn't true. For example, like in the UK, there was a very famous case a few years ago where there was a child of Jehovah's Witnesses was taken out of parental control and put into government control because the parents refused to let their child have a blood transfusion, which meant they would die. That means that parents do not always, or family members, even if they think they have the best intention at heart, might not have the best intention in the long run. I think actually all this stuff you say about emotional turmoil and being involved can sometimes cloud your vision. So actually, which means that you don't know how to feel and you're less likely to make the right choice. A doctor or the government, for example, who has a much more objective standpoint and actually knows the facts better, is much more likely to know this better anyway. So if there was a choice to be made, it should be the government, but I also just think that if you're going to come to the same decision on ad, it should be the government. But go ahead, closing. Family didn't consent to either emotional turmoil or crippling financial burden. Shouldn't they at least get
Right.
away with
I hate this argument
for
because
themselves?
it's like, I didn't consent to be born. I didn't consent for any time. I didn't consent for the weather to be cold. Like, accident has happened. The government cannot be held responsible for every small thing that happens. Like, oh, you're born with a lower IQ. That doesn't mean you should just be allowed to get into Harvard or whatever. Like, you know, it's a luck of the draw. If your family gets in a car crash, like, I'm sorry, that sucks. But, like, the government shouldn't be, like, you shouldn't then be able to, like, profit effectively of killing them. Cool. The responses they give to us is that, actually, what is the difference between passive and active euthanasia? I think it is massively different, because I think when it is a passive choice and you just pull the plug, cancer killed your grandmother, but now when it is active, an active choice, cancer didn't do it, you killed them, because I think the difference is that when it is like you have an intervention like life support there, it is something that is preventative, stopping cancer from like taking over the body, and you're just taking away the intervention, but now you're the one pushing the like lethal injection into them. That is an incredibly difficult thing, and which means I think they should remain illegal. They then say, oh, the backlash argument is not legitimate. Of course it is. Governments often don't mandate things all the time because it would take too much emotional stress. That's why people riot and it often gets things done. For example, I know like in general, like the Champs-Élysées in France, for example, managed to riot and created backlash. The governments were like, this is obviously not optimal for our like, you know, society, therefore they reversed the policy. Backlash is obviously a legitimate thing to say like in a, for like a government, a legitimate reason for a government not to do something. Yeah.
Both Er's case and your extension about medical failures hinges on the assumption that the person making the decision has certain epistemic access to the person who is dying. But this is actually impossible, since you don't even know your preferences will be tomorrow. Why are advanced directives allowed when this is not?
It was your mic that allowed advanced directives, I don't care. Cool. Weighing against opening opposition then. Their case is then, you rob someone of choice and agency. But I think has been kind of pointed out to some extent, I think when they talk about agency and consent, the problem is that either way, the person they're talking about is very likely dead in the very near future. So that means this is a harm that definitely exists, but it is like a smaller harm than what I think we bring you. Because I think we already break the agency of kids in medical decisions and things like that. I cannot be unvaccinated from things I got when I was 6 months old and things like that. If agency has already been removed, it obviously you still are breaking it principally, so it is still a bad thing, but I don't think it is as severe as the impacts want to make it out against. Weighing against the cases that we bring you, first of all, weighing on medicine engagement. I think if you care about agency, you need to have doctors to prevent, treat, and care for life, and people to engage in the medical thing, because you need to prevent people from being in, like, you know, save them from diseases which untreated will lead to a coma or death. This is what Alexander tells you, because I just think that actually people are incredibly skeptical of the medical profession. Look at the backlash towards COVID vaccines, or the fact that people, even when it, like, still opt out of organ donations, because they have an irrational fear that they will still be alive when organs are taken from them. I think also note all the stuff Alexander tells you about why families will be in emotional turmoil. It'll be really difficult for then people to go to the medical profession. I wanted to be a vet when I was younger, but when I learned I had to put down dogs, I decided I didn't want to do that. Because there's a difference between a dog dying because it was hit by a car and me trying to do my best to save it, and then me actively killing a dog. This is what people now going into medicine thinking, so less people want to become a doctor and like go to become a dentist or something like that. And I also just want to know this is like obviously true, because like dignitas doctors that like, you know, actually kill people are paid loads more than regular doctors because they have loads of emotional labor, so you're obviously not going to have all that capital. On the family trauma then, I just think on scale, their principle only applies to the one person in the coma. This applies to their entire family, who all together have to make a decision and have to decide, oh my god, like, can we afford to do this? Should we do this? What can we do? That is a horrible thing to live with, and have to make that choice even if it is normally the similar choice as the government. For all these reasons, see you.
Congratulations on finishing the round. Shake hands. We're gonna leave.